So God is working a good plan for you, his people, for me. But we found out as we opened this book of Esther that that plan rarely happens like we think it will. And last weekend, we were introduced to people that were in this story, 5 main characters in the book of Esther. The first was named Xerxes. He was a king, and his queen named Vashti. Now, I want to say that this story is not a fairy tale. It's not a Disney fairy tale. They live happily ever after. A boy meets girl. I want to kind of blow that out of the water. This is a gritty and difficult story to read. In fact, today's message is PG-13. So if you have young kids in the room, if you don't want them to hear certain things, we have an incredible kids ministry, and now would be a great time to check them in so they can hear about the Bible on their level. Otherwise, you might have some explaining to do in the car on the way home, and I'll just leave it at that. You have been warned. It's not a fairy tale in the sense that it's all beautiful, and no, there's some grit and some difficult things we're gonna read today. But it's also not a fairy tale in the fact that it's a fantasy story. It's not true. This is a story rooted not just in biblical history, but in secular history. The king that's named Xerxes was an actual Persian king. And you'll see his reliefs in museums around the world. He's always sort of the head taller than anyone around him. He was this imposing Persian king. He controlled this massive territory. He was a tyrant of tyrants. In fact, the Bible describes that he ruled 127 provinces from India all the way to North Africa. This is his entire kingdom at the time of the book of Esther. And we heard last week that he's in Susa, his winter palace, and he's having a 6-month party where he's getting all of his generals from all of these provinces of the known world, and he's having this amazing, amazing party that's all about him. People are drinking and they're celebrating their success. Xerxes is a narcissist. It's all about him. He celebrates his majesty, his glory, and his splendor because he needs all of these leaders because he's about to invade Greece. And he needs them to know they're on the winning team and he is their leader. But in the middle of this 6-month drunken party, he decides to call for his queen, Vashti. And she refuses to come to be objectified in front of a room of drunken men. She refuses to come. And so, listening to some bad advice, Xerxes deposes his queen. And now, he goes on the road. Between chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Esther, history tells us in that 4-year gap, Xerxes goes on a campaign against the Greek Empire. He travels with a 1,000,000-man army to a place called Thermopylae in Greece, where he takes on the 300 Spartans, if you know the story of the 300 Spartans. And after a lengthy battle, he defeats the 300 Spartans. But then he goes to the Bay of Salamis, where he loses most of his fleet, and he suffers a stunning defeat at the hands of the Greeks. And so now he comes back to Susa. When he left, he was the man. He was invincible. No one told him no. He always won. He always got his way, but now he limps back to his palace, his tail between his legs. The illusion of invincibility, because his ego had betrayed him. And now he's sad. And now he doesn't even have a queen. And well, when you're a tyrant and you're depressed and you're lonely, well, you start killing people for no reason. So all of his attendants are scrambling. We have to come up with something, and we can't have Vashti come back because if she comes back, she'll kill all of us because they were the ones that gave him the idea to get rid of her. So we have an idea. You wanna hear what they came up with? Do you wanna hear what they came up with? Okay, just check. Esther chapter 2, verse 2. Here we go. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for the beautiful young virgins for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. And let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who's in charge of the women. And let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." And this advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. What did they come up with? Let's have a beauty pageant. This is the original Bachelor, right? Come on, think with me, guys. Get into the story. Like, let's find the most beautiful women in 127 provinces over the entire known world. Josephus, the Jewish historian, would say there were 400 women that were taken as a part of this beauty pageant. The contest to be queen. And what was at stake? Listen, not just Miss Persia. Whoever won this contest would become the most powerful woman in the world. Miss Universe, right? That's what's at stake. And so they're gonna bring all these women. They're gonna put them in a fortress. They're gonna have guards all around them. Why guards? So people couldn't get in to get to the women, and the women wouldn't kill each other on the inside, because I've never seen The Bachelor, but I know there's like lots of all that stuff that goes on. And so this is the intrigue of the moment. This is the Persian Empire. Now we're gonna see verse 5. All of this power and pride and the politics of the Persian Empire are gonna meet this little Jewish orphan girl named Hadassah and her uncle named Mordecai. These are the third and fourth characters now introduced into the story. Verse 5 says this. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who's also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. And Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Here's the intersection of King Xerxes and the way that he's operating in his world, and now this vulnerable Jewish refugee. She's not even identified by her own Jewish name. They give her a different name. Her parents named her Hadassah, but now they've given her a Persian name named after a Greek goddess. Her name now is Esther. Even Mordecai doesn't carry a Jewish name, even though he's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's been given the name Mordecai, which is named after a Babylonian god. You see, when the Jews were taken in captivity 100 years earlier, their customs, their culture, their language was all tried to be taken out of them so that they could become like Babylonians, like Persians. But Mordecai, he had these conversations with Esther, who he raised as his own daughter. And we know this Jewish identity she carried with her through the entire story. Maybe he told her, hey, they serve many gods here in Persia, and when I was raised in Babylon, they also serve many gods, but we serve a God, his name is Jehovah. He's the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and he has a covenant promise for his people. And we know that she carried this in her because we'll watch as she operates in this very pagan environment. She operates out of this beautiful sense of faith. Now in verse 8, what happens next? When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the capital, the citadel of Susa, and put under the care of Hegai. And Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. And she pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her to 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace, and he moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Now Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. And before a young woman's turn came to go into Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. How does that sound fun to anyone? Like 12 months of beauty treatments? Guys, the next time your wife says she needs an hour to get ready, I mean, these women took a year, so just be patient. And this is how the woman would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. And in the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem, to the care of 𝘾𝙇, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. And she would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. All right, so some of you are like, oh, that sounds cool and exciting, 12 months of beauty treatments, and Esther had favor, and she got her own best place in the palace. She had 7 female attendants. That sounds awesome. But what's actually going on here in the story? What's going on here is if you look at that word taken in verse 8, that word taken, Esther was taken. It's the word for seize or acquire. It wasn't that women were all volunteering for this beauty pageant. It was they were seen as beautiful physical objects that the king would desire, and they were taken from provinces all over the world as the property of the king. They were placed in a harem of young virgin girls. Again, Josephus says 400 women in this harem. And each of them, after the year of beauty treatment, would have one night, one sexual experience with the king. And if he was pleased, he would pick among those women. Now, what do you call something like this where women are taken from their homes by force and placed in a place where they can't be with their families and they're used to satisfy a man's sexual desire? And then if they're picked, maybe they have some sort of semblance of life, and if not, their whole life is just sort of gone. Today we call that human trafficking. You see, the Bible is gritty in that it doesn't sanitize over what's happening in the Persian world. And not only were women taken in this way in the Persian Empire, but also men. You see the word eunuch. What's a eunuch? Xerxes would take 500 young men a year. He would castrate them. And then he would use them to make sure that all the women in all of his harems were being protected and that no one would sleep with the women that are part of his harem. Notice, after the women slept with the king, they would go from one harem to another where the concubines lived. That means they were the property of the king, which means if you lost the contest, that means the rest of your life, you might never see the king again. You might never see your family again, but you are the property of the king and you live in that harem for the rest of your life. This is the reality of what's going on in this moment. Now, we know that Xerxes is about 41 at the time. We know Esther is probably in her late teens or early 20s. And you see the concern of Mordecai. Mordecai is going by the gate where the harem is and trying to make contact with his adopted daughter. He wants to make sure she's okay. Are you being treated well? Are you being harassed? And there's not much he can do, but you see this fatherly love and protection he has for Esther because she is his adopted daughter who he loves. Now we watch Esther sort of through this entire second chapter win the favor of different people. She's going to win the favor of the head of the harem, Hegai. She's going to win the harem of everyone who meets her. She's going to win the favor of them, and she's going to eventually win the favor of the king. This is the way that God is working in her life. Let's look at verse 15 to see what happens next. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle, Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month of the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any other woman, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. And he proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Esther wins the contest. The favor of God is on her life. Now again, this is not a fairy tale, because if your minds are rolling like my mind is rolling as I read this, you're like, wait a second. You have this vulnerable orphan Jewish girl. She's taken by force. She's forced into this evil contest to have sex with a pagan king. Like, where's God in all this? Is she just a pawn in some game? Is Xerxes really have that much power and control that he can just change the lives of people at a whim? Here's the beautiful thing about God. God has not abandoned Esther. God is with Esther, even in the difficult moments of these circumstances. And God is working out a plan that Esther wouldn't have picked or Mordecai wouldn't have picked, but he's working out a good plan for her life and for the people of God. Even though you don't see his name, we're gonna watch his fingerprints be at work. Because when you think about favor, how does favor work? Was she the most physically attractive of the 400 women? Was it her character that attracted him? Well, it simply says, the Bible simply says that the favor of God, that she had favor in the eyes of all of these people. So here's the question. Who picked Esther to be queen? Xerxes thinks he picked her, but we know God picked her. Here's what the Proverbs say about the way that God works, even in the heart of kings who don't acknowledge him. Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is like a stream of water, directed by the Lord. He guides it wherever he pleases. And this is really good news, because if you've ever worked for a boss who's a tyrant, if you've ever lived with a tyrant, if you've ever worked with a tyrant, if you've ever been involved and you feel like your life is at the whims of this person, listen, God has a way to work in people's lives and leaders' lives and direct the way they think and feel and make decisions in a way that none of us will ever understand, because he is God and Xerxes is not God. And that is good news, right? So Xerxes is all happy. He found his queen and he says, let's have a festival, let's have a banquet. It's called Esther's banquet, and he calls a holiday. Now here's what we know, that the Persians didn't go to war for the next couple of years, and that in these occasions that the king would suspend taxes for a couple of years. So if you're a resident of Persia or anywhere in the empire, you're like, we love Esther, no more war and no more taxes. Let's celebrate, the king has a new queen, life is good, right? So everyone is celebrating. Now, what happens next? Well, verse 19. Now, we're going to see in verse 19 that Mordecai will be at the king's gate. Now, if you just read this and say he's at the king's gate, it's like he's just hanging out at the front door somewhere. But if you sat at the king's gate, that means you were part of the financial or legal processes of that kingdom. They've actually found this gate of ancient Susa. They discovered it in 1970 in an archaeological dig in Iran. This gate is 90 feet wide or thick. It's filled with all of these offices, all of these rooms. It's where people conducted business back in the day, at the gate, at the city wall. So here's Mordecai, who's probably been promoted because Esther whispered to Xerxes, hey, I've got an uncle, and he would be a great leader here in the city. And so now he's in a position of privilege and of power. And here's what happens next, verse 19. Now, when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family's background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. And during that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Xerxes didn't like people trying to assassinate him. He publicly executed them in a horrific way, and we're going to see this happen throughout the story of Esther. The Persians were brutal in the way they killed people in a very public, slow, painful death. Now, we also know that Xerxes was actually assassinated about 20 years after this by his own chief bodyguard, because when you kill everyone you disagree with, eventually someone gets mad and tries to kill you back, and that's what happened to Xerxes. But in this moment, Mordecai gets this inside information, and he has a dilemma. Do I let Esther know so she can let Xerxes know that these people are about to kill him, or should I just let this tyrant die? He decides to do what's right, and he whispers to Esther, and Esther whispers to the king, and now the plot is overthrown, and guess what happens to Mordecai? They have a party for him, they give him a gold watch, they give him a plaque, they don't give him anything. He does what's right and pretty much ignored. The only thing they do is they make a little notation in the king's book that this happened. And that's going to be very important later in the story. And so we arrive at the end of chapter 2, and we're like, oh, this is not the love story I heard about in Sunday school. What is going on? And what's going on is this. The story of the Bible. God is working a good plan in a very sinful and broken circumstance. And that good plan almost never happens like we think it should. And that should cause us to be curious. How is God doing that in my life, in my circumstances, in my imperfection, and all the brokenness around me? Because if I'm honest, I sometimes do feel like a pawn in a game that's bigger than me. I feel unseen, unheard. I don't see God working or moving. I can't feel him. I don't know how to process all that's going on in my life. But hang with us as we read the story of Esther, because you're going to see that all of these things that are happening are going to lead to something else in a way that God will beautifully weave his hand of providence through Esther's lives and through the lives of the Jewish people. Know that she has not told the king she is Jewish. Mordecai has given her this advice on several occasions. Don't reveal your nationality, because Mordecai knows this. Anti-Semitism has been around for a long, long time. There are people that want to kill and destroy God's chosen people, the Jewish people, but we as a church, we stand with God's chosen people. We love and honor them because from them comes our Messiah, and in his ultimate return, he's gonna bring a restoration that will amaze us. It'll amaze us. So we're gonna read more about that in the coming weeks. But so what's our takeaway as the people of God? Okay, so don't have a harem, okay? Don't use your power to exploit people. Yeah, we get that, but what are some things we can take away? I want to give you 4 quick takeaways as we process chapter 2 of Esther. Here's the first one that we see in Esther herself. Embrace your disadvantages. What do I mean by that? Well, it's not hard for people to embrace their advantages. God gave me the ability to sing or speak. He made my body a certain way to compete. He gave me my mind so I can understand and process and synthesize information. He gave me social skills so I know how to connect with people and build networks. We all have different gifts, and we take gifts tests to figure out how has God wired me so that I can fulfill my purpose. But we almost never pay attention to our deficits, to our disabilities, to our disadvantages. It's like we don't want to think and look at them because we really wish we didn't have them. But there's a whole field of social science that says that people are successful in life not in spite of their disabilities and disadvantages, but because of them. Think with me for a second. That we as people, we aren't successful in life in spite of disadvantages, but because of them. And the Bible tells this story. You just page through the Bible. Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt because he was falsely accused and placed in prison. It was because of prison and false accusation he became prime minister of Egypt. Think about Ruth. It was because of death and tragedy and loss and heartbreak that she met and married Boaz and became the great grandmother of David, the king. And David the king, it was because he was neglected by his own family, disregarded by his own father, that he was sent into a field to feed sheep while his brothers had the best military training of their day in Saul's army. And because this little shepherd boy had nothing to do but play the harp and write songs and practice throwing rocks with his sling, that he was called upon to fight a giant. And because of that sling and that stone, he killed a giant and he became the hero of Israel, the king of the nation. And so as the people of God, we should just pause and take stock. What are the disabilities or disadvantages that I've experienced in life? Just make a mental list. Maybe the things that you wish weren't true about you. God, I have this learning disability. I've had it my whole life, and other people can learn. I don't learn in that way. I have this social anxiety. Everyone seems to be at home in their own skin and at home in a crowd, and I just want to disappear. God, I grew up poor. I grew up with no resources, and to this day, I wish I could change my childhood. I experienced loss and tragedy in my childhood, the divorce of my parents, the abuse at the hands of other people, and God, I just wish that those things hadn't hadn't happened to me. Here's the power of the gospel. Jesus can take all those things and make them the raw material of not just the person you'll become, but some of the greatest things you'll ever do in life. Because God doesn't waste anything. And you get this sense from Esther that God's not wasting the fact that her parents died, the fact that she was orphaned, the fact that she was given a name that was not her name, the fact that Persia tried to make her a certain type of person, but she knew in her heart who she was. And you don't see in her this sense of entitlement or any of those other things, because God used all those disadvantages for his purpose. You know, there's a moment in the New Testament where Paul the apostle, the man who wrote so much of our Bible, he has this ailment, this disability. We don't know if it's physical, emotional, or spiritual. He just says, God, this is a thorn in my flesh. And he prayed, he pleaded with God, God, take this away from me. And God said, after 3 times of begging and pleading, God said, no. And here's the reason he gives to Paul. He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul's response is, therefore I will now boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. And then he says, because when I am weak, then I am strong. We as the people of God need to embrace the disadvantages, the brokenness of our life, because those might be the raw material that God uses, like he did in Esther. The second thing, we don't just embrace disadvantages, but we also reject entitlement. You see, the Persians gave Hadassah a new name, Esther, and Esther means star. And in this take advantage culture of Persia, where power and politics reign, where you take more than you give, well, Esther is trying to be molded into a certain kind of person, but you watch her resist it at every single turn. 12 months of beauty treatment may make the outside look really good, but it's years of cultivating character that made Esther beautiful on the inside. She knew who she was. Persia tried to give her a different name. She knew who she was. She didn't succumb to the luxury of her surroundings. She didn't come to the place where now she's queen and now she can do whatever she wants. She's still taking the advice of her uncle Mordecai, her adoptive father. She's not demanding from Haggai all these privileges. She's humbly receiving and sort of floating through all of the moments of this story in just a beautiful way. You see, because this spirit of entitlement that existed in Persia also exists today. You can define entitlement by these 2 words: I deserve. And that attitude is pervasive in our culture. I deserve. And if I don't get what I deserve, then someone owes me. You owe me, or this person owes me, or that organization owes me, or God owes me. Esther did not give way to entitlement. She also didn't give way to the victim identity that often leads to entitlement. She could have identified herself as this oppressed person, as this orphan, as this person who's being taken advantage of in this whole slog of Persian power. And yet we watch her identify in a much, much different way because, again, she knows who she is. And so here's one of the questions we have to ask ourselves. And if I suffer from brokenness or injustice in some way, do I wear the clothes of victimhood? Has that become my identity? Or have I learned to see in a different way what a conqueror is, an identity that God gives me? You see, Paul would say that no matter what happens in our life, we can wear a certain identity because the most important thing about you is what God says about you, right? I want to say that again. The most important thing about you aren't your gifts or your disabilities or disadvantages. The most important thing about you is what God says about you. And Paul in Romans 8 says this. He says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? He says, no. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us, right? No matter what has happened in your life or what is happening in your life, God says you are not a victim. You are more than a conqueror because I have a way to redeem that brokenness in your life. It doesn't mean that injustice wasn't wrong. And it doesn't mean it wasn't painful. It just means that God wants to redeem and heal so that you can become a person who walks and lives as a conqueror. Now, the most dangerous type of entitlement is not the entitlement toward other people or organizations or systems. The most dangerous entitlement is entitlement to God. What do you mean? I mean, it's where you say, God, I've been following you for like a year, and now my boss just fired me. Like, you can't do that to me. I've been doing this. You owe me. God, I've been faithfully leading a Bible study and helping all these people in my life, and now I'm experiencing this sickness or this financial pressure. And God, you got to do something because I deserve something more. Now, most of us will never say this out loud. But if we're honest, those moments come up where it feels like we're transactional. We do stuff for God and then we expect him to do stuff for us, but we want to resist and reject that type of entitlement. We see Esther do it over and over and over and over again. And I want to share with you a story of my wife and I. We have a good friend named Lisa. And she loves Jesus. She loves her husband. She loves her kids. She's raised them so well. She's been a leader in this church. She leads Bible studies, and she just got a very, very difficult cancer diagnosis, liver cancer. And for some people, that would be crushing. They would question the faith. And it's not like she hasn't had moments of question and moments of doubt and moments of what if and I don't know. But most of the time when I talk to Lisa, there is a smile on her face because she knows she is more than a conqueror in Christ and nothing can separate her from the love of Christ. And she lives in that identity because that's the identity that God has given her. And so as Christians, we want to identify with who God says that we are and reject the entitlement that wants to give us a different name. The third thing we see in Esther is that she chooses submission, and we can choose submission. Now, when I say choose submission, some of you are like, he just used the S word, because that word has lots of weight and lots of triggers for lots of people. Because submission in the world, we've seen it in toxic relationships, in broken organizations, in churches that are dysfunctional, where submission becomes a form of manipulation and control. And so we sort of overcompensate and say, we're never gonna give our will over to someone else because we might be hurt, but the reason that we submit as the people of God is because Jesus did. Because he submitted to the Father in Hebrews 5 out of reverent submission. He said, God, whatever you want me to do, I will do. And as followers of Christ, we have this opportunity to submit as Esther did. So listen, this is crazy, but in verse 15, it says, she submitted to the advice and counsel of Mordecai, as she had done as a child growing up. She's the most powerful woman in the world, and she's still taking the advice of her adoptive father because she knows this is a man I can trust. And even if I don't agree, I'm gonna follow his advice because there are times in life where we stand and we defy something that's wrong. And there are times that we also submit and honor the leaders that are in our lives, whether it's our parents as children, whether it's our husband if we're a wife, whether it's the people that are spiritual leaders in our lives. And in fact, the author of Hebrews says this about the people that God has placed in our life over us as people to protect us. He says, have confidence in your leaders and submit to their authority because they keep watch over you as those who must give an account. And do this so their work will be a joy and not a burden, for that would be of no benefit to you. Do you have confidence in the spiritual leaders God has placed over you? Maybe a question that you can answer today as you sit here is, when was the last time I submitted to someone in my life, my way, my idea, my preference? And if you can't think of a time in the last year, maybe God will put this sense of conviction. God, I don't want to be a person who's always doing what I want to do, is saying what I want to say. I want to be a person that receives advice, that's teachable. Listen, how does that work out for regular people, for everyday moments? It's you're in a group, and your small group leader pulls you aside after and says, you're starting this relationship with this guy, and honestly, I've got like a couple of really big red flags. And you're thinking, no, he's great. He's amazing. But there's something in that man's eyes, something in his wife's eyes that looks at you with concern and care and says, everything that glitters is not gold. And here's what he's told you. And here's where our concern is. And then you have a choice. They don't know him. Or maybe God has given them wisdom to speak into my life, and I've got a choice to make. Do I ignore that advice, or do I humbly, quietly say, okay, help me to see what I can't see, and what should I do next? And pray with me so I know how to make the right choices. That's what the beautiful submission looks like, to the right people in the right moments in the right way. And we see, again, this through Esther's life in the way that she interacts with Hegai, the head of the harem, in the way that she interacts with Mordecai, and in the moments to come, in the chapters to come, this beautiful heart of submission. So, as the people of God, we embrace our disadvantages, we reject entitlement, and we choose submission. And fourth, and finally, we do what's right. Mordecai hears about the conspiracy to kill the king. He has a choice to make, and he chooses to do what is right. And he follows this incredible tradition of exiles that are Jewish in Babylon and Persia who have to stand and do what's right no matter what the cost. A few years earlier, 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, stood in defiance to the king to bow down to an idol. And they did what was right, and you know what happened? As a result, they got thrown into a fire. But Jesus met them in the fire because he has a way of showing up in those moments in beautiful ways, right? But here's the challenge with doing what's right. Every time you do what's right, almost immediately, right after, something bad happens. Can we be real in church? Mordecai does what's right, and the tyrant king stays in power. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do what's right. They get thrown into the fire. And this is why it's hard to continue to do what's right. So about 10 or 15 years ago, my wife is walking out of a gym. And she walks into the street, across to the parking lot to get to her car, and she sees a wad of cash. I'm talking about a thick wad of cash, probably more than $1,000 in cash. And she looks left and right. There's nobody. And she picks it up, and she's been praying, God, I need some money to decorate the house. Thank you, God, you answered my prayer. You are good. And now she has a choice. Do I just consider this a blessing from God and get in my car and leave? Or do I try to figure out where this came from and who dropped it? And so she looked at the closest establishment, which was the gym, and she took that wad of cash and she walked back into the gym. And she starts explaining to the manager, hey, I found this in the middle of the parking lot. He's looking at her like, what is wrong with you? And while she's talking to him, this massive, massive guy walks back in the gym, and he is stressed, he's sweating. He's like, I lost like all my money. I lost my huge wad of cash. And as he's talking, my wife says, is this what you're looking for? And he looked at her like she was crazy. She said, I found it in the parking lot. And he said, why would you do that? And she said, because I'm a follower of Jesus. I just want you to know he loves you. Right? Now, she didn't have her decorating money because every time you do something that's right, something bad happens initially. But the trajectory of your life, the trajectory of the people around you will begin to retell that story in a whole different way because every time you choose what's right, God is building your character from the inside out, and God's favor will be over your life in ways that never will when you compromise. And Esther lives this story, and we as the people of God have a chance to live it with her. So if you've gotten tired of doing what's right, you got tired of being the only person in your family who's following God, the only person who's trying to make peace, the only person in your business who's trying to be ethical and do things the right way, and you feel like everyone succeeded except you. Well, there's a verse in the Bible just for you, Galatians 6:9. So let's not get tired of doing what is good. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. Christian, don't give up doing what's right. God has a blessing for you. And so here we end chapter 2. And I can't wait to come back next week to read chapter 3 because we're going to have a few amazing plot twists and turns that come. So read chapter 3 ahead and come back curious. How is God going to be at work in this story? And how is God going to be at work in my life? And we're going to see in beautiful and powerful ways that God is at work even if we can't see him, even if we can't feel him. And his love for us and his plan for us is good. Can we thank him for his goodness and his grace in our lives? And let's take a moment and pray. God, we thank you for writing the story of our life. We thank you for weaving together both the good and the hard things for a good purpose. We don't always understand it. We don't always know the why. But today, as your people, we say we trust you. And we thank you for heroes like Esther, like Mordecai, who stand up for what is right in the face of so much pressure to compromise. Make us people of conviction. Make us people of purpose. And God, use us for your honor. And we pray this in Jesus' name.